Somewhere in the archives of a mid-sized timber company based out of Lewiston, Idaho, there is a file that should not exist. It contains 3 separate non-disclosure agreements, each one attached to a 6-figure settlement payment made to a different logging crew, each crew having abandoned the same remote lease parcels in the upper drainages of northern Idaho's Clearwater Mountains within a span of 26 months. The file also contains thermal camera footage captured by the company's own monitoring equipment on a ridgeline 43 miles from the nearest paved road. The footage shows something moving through old-growth western red cedar at 2 in the morning that does not match any species in Idaho Fish and Game's predator classification system. The company's internal memorandum recommends permanent withdrawal of all harvest activity from the lease and characterizes the situation in language so carefully hedged that you can feel the lawyers in every sentence. What the memorandum does not say, what no official document associated with this company will ever say, is the word that the 3 crew bosses and the company forester, who investigated the incidents, all used independently when they described what was on that mountain: dogmen. 3 crews, 3 encounters, 3 settlements, and a 40,000-acre timber lease, abandoned without public explanation, on some of the most valuable standing timber in the inland Northwest. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. The man who brought this story to us was not one of the crew bosses. He was the company forester who was sent up the mountain after each incident to assess the situation and make a recommendation. He agreed to talk on one condition: no real names. His, the company's, or the crew's. We will call him Mitch. Given the non-disclosure agreements involved and the fact that his pension is tied to a company that has spent the better part of a decade making sure this story never surfaces, you will understand why. Mitch spent over 20 years working as a field forester in the timber industry of north-central Idaho. He started in his mid-20s with a forestry degree from a state university in the Pacific Northwest and worked his way up from timber cruiser to district forester for one of the private companies that holds land across Clearwater and Idaho counties. His job was to walk timber, estimate board footage, plan harvest units, mark boundaries, and coordinate with logging contractors. He knew the Clearwater Mountains the way a river guide knows his stretch of water, by feel, by season. By the way, light hits a slope at a particular hour and tells you about the drainage and the soil before you ever put a tape on a tree. The timber industry in north-central Idaho is not an abstraction. It is the economic spine of communities that would not exist without it. Towns like Orofino, Pierce, Kamaya, Elk River. The Potlatch Lumber Company built its first sawmill in this region in 1903, processing white pine from one of the largest stands in the nation. The log drives ran the North Fork of the Clearwater from 1928 through 1971. Men in spiked boots riding timber down 60 miles of whitewater. The industry has contracted since those days, consolidated into fewer and larger operations, but the culture remains. A forester in Clearwater County is not a cubicle worker. He is a man whose professional identity is built on knowing the mountains, reading the terrain, making decisions in conditions where a wrong call can cost a life. Mitch was that kind of forester. His colleagues trusted his field assessments the way you trust the word of someone who has earned it through decades of being right. The lease in question covered roughly 40,000 acres of private industrial timberland in the high country between the North Fork of the Clearwater River and the Loxa River corridor, straddling the border between Clearwater and Idaho counties. If you have ever driven Highway 12 east from Kewaskia toward Lolo Pass, you have looked up at the ridgelines where this lease sat without knowing it. The terrain is steep, deeply dissected by creek drainages that cut down through basalt and granite to reach the North Fork and its tributaries. The canopy at elevation is a mix of Douglas fir, grand fir, western white pine, Engelmann spruce, and at the higher reaches, subalpine fir and mountain hemlock. In the creek bottoms and on the north-facing slopes, old-growth western red cedar survives in groves that predate European arrival on this continent by centuries. Morris Cedar Grove, about 30 miles to the northwest near Elk River, contains Idaho's largest tree, a western red cedar over 3,000 years old. The cedars on the lease were not that ancient, but some were substantial, and the company valued the entire lease at over $20 million. Access required driving Forest Road 250 south from the community of Pierce, then turning onto company-maintained logging roads that climbed for another 20-odd miles before reaching the first harvest units. The last 12 miles were single-lane gravel built in the 1980s during the previous harvest cycle, maintained intermittently since then, and subject to washouts every spring when the snowmelt came down off the ridges. In a good truck with decent clearance, you could make Pierce to the upper units in about 3 hours. In bad weather or during spring breakup, you could not make it at all. The isolation was the point. Industrial timberland in this part of Idaho exists in a different category from the managed forests closer to the mills. It is backcountry. The roads are built for logging trucks and maintained only when harvest is active. Between harvest cycles, which on a 40-year rotation means most of the time, the roads deteriorate, the culverts plug, the alders grow in from the shoulders, and the forest reclaims whatever ground the bulldozers carved out. These parcels are functionally wilderness. No permanent structures, no power lines, no cell service. The company acquired the lease in 2008, during a period when several large timber holders were restructuring after the housing market collapse. For the first several years, the company did nothing with the lease except pay annual fees and send Mitch up once or twice a year to cruise timber and update the inventory. He made his first trip to the upper parcels in the fall of 2009, drove up alone, parked at the end of the maintained road, and hiked into the timber with his cruising gear, a GPS, a field notebook, and a .30-06 that he carried more out of habit than expectation. Black bears were common at elevation in the fall. He had seen wolf tracks on company land over the years. Mountain lions were present but rarely seen, the standard predator complement for the Clearwater Mountains, nothing a forester with 20 years in these woods could not handle. He spent 3 days cruising timber in the units flagged for potential harvest. Good wood. Old second-growth Douglas fir on the south-facing slopes, some approaching 120 years old, straight and tall, the kind of timber that mills in Lewiston and Orofino would pay premium stumpage for. On the north-facing slopes and in the creek bottoms, the cedar groves. Mitch walked through them slowly, the way you walk through a cathedral. Trunks 8 and 10 feet in diameter, rising from ferns and moss so thick your boots sank to the ankle. The light filtered through the canopy in shafts that turned the air green. The smell was cedar and damp earth, and something older than either. He did not notice anything unusual on that first trip, or the second, or the third. Over the next several years, he visited the lease a dozen times or more, building the inventory that would justify the harvest investment. In 2015, the company decided it was time. Lumber prices had recovered. The Douglas fir market was strong. The company secured permits from the Idaho Department of Lands and put the first harvest units out to bid in early 2016. A crew out of Kamaya won the contract. We will call their boss Len. Len ran a 5-man outfit that had been cutting timber in Clearwater and Idaho counties for over 15 years. They had worked remote sales before, the kind where you camp near the landing and do not see another person for a week. They mobilized in June of 2016, once the snow cleared and the ground firmed. Mitch drove up with the crew on the first day to walk the units and mark boundaries. Len's crew had a travel trailer parked at the landing for sleeping quarters and a second for equipment storage, generator for power, satellite phone for emergencies, standard remote logging setup. Mitch drove back to Orofino that evening. The upper lease was Len's responsibility now. Mitch would drive up every 2 weeks to check progress. The first issue came up 9 days later. Len called on the satellite phone at 6 in the morning. His voice was controlled, the way people sound when they are working hard to keep something specific out of their tone. He said somebody had been on the landing overnight. Mitch asked if he meant trespassers. Len was quiet for a moment. Then he said he did not think it was a person. Mitch drove up that day. The excavator's hydraulic lines had been damaged. 2 of them wrenched loose from their fittings by a grip strong enough to twist the fitting until it failed. Hydraulic fluid had pooled under the machine overnight. The skidder's fuel cap was missing, the fuel contaminated with dirt and gravel. A chainsaw left in the equipment trailer had been moved during the night. The chain bar bent at an angle that suggested it had been swung against something with force. Mitch examined the damage and walked the perimeter looking for boot prints or tire tracks. Found nothing human. What he found At the edge of the gravel where the landing transitioned to timber was a set of tracks pressed into soft soil, canid in shape, 4 toes, claw marks at the front, a broad pad, but the scale was wrong. Each track was roughly 7 inches long and 5 inches wide. The largest gray wolf track documented in Idaho was around 5.5. These were bigger, and the depth, nearly 2 inches into the soil, implied a weight far beyond any canid he had encountered in 2 decades of working these mountains. He photographed the tracks. He told Len the damage looked like vandalism from hikers who had come in on a Forest Service trail that crossed the company boundary a few miles to the east. Then he drove down the mountain with the photographs on his phone and a knot in his stomach. That evening at his kitchen table in Orofino, Mitch looked at the photographs and accepted what his eyes had already told him. The tracks did not belong to any species in the state's wildlife classification guide. Len's crew continued working. The equipment was repaired. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then, in the 3rd week of July, they found the deer. A mature mule deer buck was lying at the base of a marked boundary tree about 200 yards from the active cutting area. The deer's neck was broken. The head was rotated almost completely around on the spine, in a way that no fall or normal predator attack could explain. A single wound on the throat had opened the windpipe and the carotid. The wound was clean. 1 puncture, 1 tear, precise and deep. There was remarkably little blood on the ground, which meant the deer had been killed somewhere else and moved to this location, dragged, based on the marks in the duff where the body had been pulled through ferns, dragged to the base of a tree that Mitch had spray-painted with the company's boundary marking 2 months earlier. The placement bothered Mitch more than the kill. An animal killed by a cougar would be cached under a deadfall. An animal killed by wolves would be consumed on site or scattered. This deer had been positioned at a marked tree, like a statement left on a doorstep when you want the person inside to understand that you have been there and that you know which door is theirs. 3 nights later, 2 of Len's crew members were in the travel trailer when they heard something outside. They described it to Mitch afterward, separately, and their accounts matched. A vocalization that started low, below the range of any animal they associated with the Clearwater Mountains. It rose through a series of tones they both described as structured, with pattern and variation, the way a language has pattern and variation. It came from maybe 100 yards into the timber to the east. Then, from a different direction, from the south side of the landing where the slope dropped toward a creek drainage, a second vocalization answered. Lower, deeper. The 2 sounds overlapped for several seconds before both stopped at the same time. Neither man slept that night. Len had been hearing things himself. Movement in the timber too heavy for deer, a weight to the footfalls that vibrated through the ground. But the vocalization was beyond ordinary night sounds. 2 separate sources, coordinating. Len called Mitch and said the crew wanted to leave. Mitch drove up, sat with Len on the tailgate of his truck, listened to everything, and then made a decision he has questioned every day since. He asked them to stay 1 more week. He said he would bring monitoring equipment. What Mitch brought up the mountain was 4 trail cameras purchased with his own money and a thermal imaging monocular borrowed from a friend at Idaho Fish and Game. He placed the cameras at the 4 corners of the landing, and he stayed on the landing that night. It was July. The light did not leave the sky until after 10. Mitch sat in his truck at the landing's edge with the windows down, watching the tree line through binoculars as the light faded. The crew was in the trailer. The generator was off. The only sounds were the creak in the drainage below, a great horned owl on the ridge, and the pop of cooling metal from the equipment. At 11:40, he heard something moving in the timber to the east. Something heavier, moving with a rhythm too slow for a running animal and too steady for a foraging one. A walk. Something large, moving through the forest with the confidence of a being that does not consider itself prey. He brought the thermal monocular to his eye and scanned the tree line. 50 yards in, he picked up a heat signature that made his knuckles go white. It was standing between 2 Douglas firs, upright, on 2 legs. The thermal image showed a torso broad through the chest, tapering at the waist. The arms hung below the waist to a length no human body would produce, and the head had a profile that extended forward from the skull in a way that was unmistakably a muzzle. A canine head on a body standing the way a person stands. Mitch watched for roughly 20 seconds. It did not move. It stood between those trees with its head angled slightly, oriented toward the landing, toward the truck, toward him. He could not see eye color through the thermal image, but the angle of the head left no question about where its attention was directed. The posture was not aggressive. It was not crouched or leaning forward in the way a predator positions before a charge. It was standing with the weight settled, the body relaxed, the head turned. The posture of a property owner who has heard a car pull into his driveway and has walked to the window to see who it is. Neither alarmed nor threatened, just aware. Then a second heat signature appeared. Smaller, about 30 yards to the left, moving on 4 legs but with the same thermal profile, same head shape, same body mass relative to the surrounding vegetation. It paused even with the first figure. Both were still, facing the landing, 2 of them. Watching from 50 yards out with the patience of things that have been watching from those trees for longer than the trees have been there. He started the truck. Both heat signatures vanished the moment his engine fired. They moved the instant the engine turned over, which meant they were listening, they were waiting, and they understood what a truck engine starting meant. They understood that the human was about to move. That awareness of human technology, the ability to interpret a mechanical sound and predict the behavior it precedes, is not instinct. It is learned intelligence. Whatever those things were, they had spent enough time around human vehicles to know what an ignition sounds like and what it means. He sat in the truck with the engine running for 20 minutes, scanning with the thermal monocular, finding nothing. Then he turned off the engine and sat in silence for another hour. He heard something very large moving through timber to the south. 3 or 4 footfalls that vibrated through the ground with a weight suggesting between 300 and 500 pounds. One trail camera triggered twice overnight. The second trigger showed a figure partially screened by a fir trunk, about 40 yards out, infrared, grainy, but the shape was unmistakable. Broad shoulders, upright, arms past the hips. The head in profile showed the elongated muzzle and pointed ears. The figure was looking at the camera, eye shine bouncing the infrared emitter back with the forward-set spacing of a predator. Mitch told Len to shut down. Crew paid for the remaining contract. Off the mountain by noon. He called the regional manager in Portland, described everything, and emailed the trail camera image. The company did not send a wildlife biologist. They did not contact Idaho Fish and Game. They drafted an NDA, offered Len's crew a settlement exceeding the remaining contract value, and told Mitch to keep the footage on a secure drive offline. The decision was financial. Over $20 million in timber. The regional manager calculated that the animals would move on during winter, and a fresh crew would complete the harvest. A reasonable calculation from a Portland office. Less reasonable if you had sat in a truck at midnight watching something with a canine skull study you through the darkness with the patience of a thing that has all the time in the world. Mitch spent that winter researching on his own time. He found the Dogman research, Linda Godfrey's work from Wisconsin and the Great Lakes, the Steve Cook song from 1987, the legend, the April Fool's prank that became real when witnesses started calling in with matching reports, the Bray Road Beast, the 1887 Wexford County lumberjack sighting, reports from Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, Oregon, Washington. Separated by thousands of miles and over a century, the descriptions were consistent. Upright posture, canine head, dark fur, 7 to 8 feet tall, intelligent behavior, nocturnal, territorial. His trail camera image matched every one. He did not share the research with the company. He understood that attaching the word Dogman to an official communication would end his career. The second crew arrived in June of 2017, an outfit from the Panhandle that had worked Bonner and Boundary County timber for years. We will call their foreman Darrell. The company told him nothing about the previous summer. The NDA ensured Darrell would not hear about it. Darrell's crew lasted 22 days. The first week was unremarkable, but Darrell told Mitch during a second-week visit that the forest above the cutting area was wrong. No birds calling in the upper canopy, no squirrels, No deer in 3 weeks of working a ridgeline that Mitch's own inventory described as excellent mule deer range. Mitch said the wildlife might be avoiding the logging noise. Darrell looked at him the way Len had looked at him over the deer, the look of a man who has been working in these mountains long enough to know the difference. On the 18th day, Darrell's crew found claw marks on 3 Douglas firs in the cutting unit. Deep vertical gouges from about 4 feet off the ground to over 7. 4 parallel grooves, spaced roughly 3 inches apart, gouged past the bark and into the cambium. The tallest mark was well above the standing reach of even a large boar black bear, which in Idaho maxes out around 6 feet. Mitch measured them and recognized what he was looking at. Territorial markers, boundary signs positioned along a line that, when plotted on his map, corresponded to the northern edge of the active harvest area. Whatever was on that mountain had drawn a line. The cutting had crossed it. On the 21st night, Darrell heard the vocalization. One voice, low and resonant, climbing through frequencies and dropping back in a pattern that repeated 3 times. He told Mitch it sounded too organized to be an animal. On the 22nd morning, both of the crew's game cameras were found on the ground. The mounting straps had been unfastened, the buckle mechanisms opened, the cameras set down facing upward. They had not been destroyed or smashed. They had been carefully removed and placed. Whatever did this had operated buckle mechanisms with the dexterity of fingers that understood how a buckle works. Darrell pulled his crew that afternoon. He did not call Mitch first. He called the company's regional manager directly and said he was leaving the site due to unsafe conditions. The regional manager called Mitch. Mitch drove to Pierce and intercepted the crew as they came off the logging road. Darrell was calm. His crew was not. 2 of the younger men were visibly rattled. One of them had been crying and would not make eye contact with anyone. Mitch sat with Darrell in the cab of his truck while the rest of the crew loaded their personal gear into their vehicles. Darrell told him everything. The silence in the forest, the claw marks on the boundary trees, the vocalization at night, the cameras removed by hands that understood buckle mechanisms. And then, the faller's sighting. The man had been working the upper unit on the 20th day, running his saw through a Douglas fir at chest height when he glanced upslope during a pause to clear chips from his bar. 150 yards above him, at the edge of where the cut timber transitioned to standing forest, something was watching him. Upright, tall, dark. Standing between 2 trees with its head turned toward him, still as stone, positioned in a way that suggested it had been there for a while. The faller said he looked at it for maybe 3 seconds before the saw dropped out of his hands and he was running. He did not look back. He ran downhill through slash and over stumps for 200 yards until he reached the landing, and he did not stop until he was inside the equipment trailer with the door closed. Darrell said the man was not someone who scared easily. He had been cutting timber in dangerous conditions for years. He had been charged by a black bear sow with cubs and stood his ground until it turned. He had been on a hillside when a tree hung up on its neighbor and had to be felled from a position that any sane person would have walked away from. He was not a man who dropped his saw and ran. Whatever he saw on that slope was so far outside his frame of reference that his body overrode his training and put him in motion before his mind finished processing what his eyes were telling him. The second NDA was drafted within the week. The second settlement paid. Darrell's crew signed and drove back to the Panhandle, and none of them, to Mitch's knowledge, have worked south of Bonner County since. Mitch told the regional manager the lease should be suspended. The regional manager disagreed. $20 million in standing timber. Permits in place. Shareholders expecting returns on a lease that had been on the books for a decade. Suspending the harvest because 2 crews reported unusual wildlife activity was not a conversation the regional manager was prepared to have with the board. If you have spent any time in the upper North Fork Clearwater drainage, if you have driven Forest Road 250 south from Pierce, or come over Hoodoo Pass from Superior, Montana, you know the landscape I am describing. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had anything out there you could not explain, because the reports from the drainages between the North Fork and the Loxa suggest a lot more activity than most people realize. The 3rd crew arrived in May of 2018. This outfit came from western Montana, contracted through a regional logging broker. We will call their foreman, Stu. He ran an 8-man crew with heavier equipment, including a tower yarder for steep slope operations. The company had upgraded the access road over winter and installed 4 weatherproof security cameras with cellular uplink at the landing, presented to Stu as security against equipment theft but intended to document whatever had been visiting. Mitch also placed 6 personal trail cameras in the surrounding timber at 50 to 200 yards, covering approach routes. He wrapped them in bark-patterned cloth, mounted them inside tree forks screened by branches, wore rubber gloves, and varied his approach routes. He was learning from what the creatures had taught the previous crews about how they operated. The first 2 weeks went well. The trail cameras captured elk, deer, a black bear sow, a pine marten, normal traffic. The silence that Len and Daryl had reported was absent. Mitch considered that whatever had been on the mountain might have relocated. The Nez Perce Clearwater National Forests contain over 4 million acres. There was no shortage of places for a territorial predator to go. On a Thursday night in late June, the company camera system recorded footage that Mitch later described as the most disturbing thing he has ever seen. At 1:22 in the morning, the motion sensor triggered. 2 figures emerged from the timber on the east side. They were upright, moving in parallel, maintaining about 15 feet of spacing, matching stride. The leading figure, based on its height relative to the excavator cab, stood between 7 and 7.5 feet. The second was smaller, maybe 6 to 6.5, its movement slightly less fluid, the way a younger animal moves alongside an experienced adult. They crossed the open ground of the landing in roughly 8 seconds. They did not stop at the equipment. They did not investigate the trailers where 8 men were sleeping. They walked straight across and into the timber on the west side. Mitch described the gait as efficient and unhurried. They walked the way apex predators walk through their own territory. 2 of Mitch's personal trail cameras had been found and removed. Mounting straps unbuckled, cameras placed face up on the ground. The footage on the SD card showed a hand entering the frame from below, reaching for the housing, then the image spinning as the camera was removed. The hands were large, dark-furred on the back, with lighter skin on the palms. The fingers were long, articulated, with claws visible at the tips. They were a hybrid of primate grip and canid anatomy, and they operated the buckle mechanisms with precision that implied understanding of the device's purpose. That restraint told Mitch what the equipment damage and territorial markings had not communicated fully. The creatures were making decisions. Sabotage had not worked during the first summer. The humans kept coming back. Now the creatures were observing, recalculating. 4 nights later, they stopped observing. 3 figures this time, approaching from the north. The third was the largest Mitch had seen on any recording, close to 8 feet. They moved onto the landing together and split apart. One went to the tower yarder, one to the excavator. The third, the largest, walked to the crew trailers and stood outside for approximately 30 seconds, head tilted, listening. Then they went to work. Every accessible hydraulic line on the excavator was torn out. The yarder's wiring harness was pulled apart in sections, the connectors separated with what the later investigation described as controlled force rather than ripping. The skidder's cab door was wrenched off its hinges and thrown 15 feet from the machine. Fuel tanks were breached by punctures through the steel walls, holes that the equipment assessor later said were consistent with something driving a claw or a hard point through quarter-inch metal. Control panels were smashed. The destruction was focused and efficient, targeting the systems that made each machine functional, while leaving the structural frames and booms largely intact. The pattern matched what had happened during the first summer, but the scale was different. During the first crew, 2 hydraulic lines and a contaminated fuel tank. This time, everything. Every system on every machine. Total operational kill. The audio captured vocalizations throughout. Deep rhythmic exchanges as they moved from machine to machine. Calls passing back and forth with a cadence that Mitch compared to radio traffic between soldiers clearing a building. Short bursts, followed by pauses, followed by responses, the pattern repeating as the figures moved to different positions on the landing. The audio analyst the company later retained, a man with a background in bioacoustics, described the patterns as more complex than any known canid vocalization and more structured than primate contact calls. He said the sequential organization of the sounds suggested information was being exchanged, though he could not determine the content. He said he had analyzed communication patterns from wolves, coyotes, elephants, and great apes, and what was on this recording did not fit any of those categories. The figure that stood outside the trailers did not touch them. It stood there for 30 seconds while the other two destroyed $500,000 in equipment 60 yards away. It listened, it assessed, and then it walked away. When the others finished, all three walked to the access road and stood together, facing downhill, facing the direction the crews would drive when they left. They stood there for a long moment, three silhouettes against the faintly lighter sky above the tree line, and then they stepped off into the timber and were gone. That image, the three of them on the road facing downhill, is the one Mitch returns to more than any other. The road leads down. The road leads away. Take it. Stu found the damage at 5 in the morning. The crew was off the mountain by 7. The third NDA was the most expensive. Equipment losses, full contract payment, and a confidentiality premium large enough to buy a house in western Montana. 8 signatures, 3 crews, 3 summers, 3 settlements totaling in the high 6 figures approaching 7. 40,000 acres of timber still standing. The company's internal review was handled by 2 Portland executives and the corporate attorney. They flew to Boise and met with Mitch in a hotel conference room for 6 hours. They reviewed all camera footage on a laptop, playing the security camera recordings frame by frame, pausing on the figures, zooming into the thermal profiles. They listened to the audio with the bioacoustics analysis report open in front of them. They examined Mitch's trail camera images, the captures showing hands reaching for camera housings, the hands with their dark fur and articulated fingers and visible claws. They studied his photographs of tracks and territorial claw markings. They asked detailed questions about terrain, access routes, lease boundaries, and proximity to public land and residential properties. They asked how many individuals Mitch believed were on the mountain. They asked whether the creatures had ever been observed outside the lease boundary. They asked about seasonal patterns. They asked about the likelihood of additional groups on other company holdings in the region. Mitch answered everything with the precision of a field professional delivering a briefing. He told them there was at least one group of large bipedal canids, minimum 3 individuals based on size variation in the footage, operating as a social unit with apparent territorial behavior, high intelligence, and demonstrated understanding of human technology and operations. He told them the creatures had escalated their response over 3 successive encounters, from equipment damage to vocal warning to total destruction of operational capacity, while consistently avoiding direct confrontation with humans. He told them the behavior matched a documented phenomenon known as dogman that had been studied across the continent for over 3 decades. He told them he did not expect the creatures to leave the mountain voluntarily, and that any future harvest attempt would likely face further escalation. Nobody said the word dogman back to him. Nobody acknowledged the phenomenon. The discussion was entirely about liability, contractual exposure, and asset valuation. If a crew member was injured or killed on the lease, the company's exposure was catastrophic. If the footage became public through a leak or a lawsuit, the reputational damage to the company's brand and its relationship with other timber contractors would be severe. If the settlements were disclosed, the company would face questions about workplace safety that it could not answer without revealing what it knew. The recommendation was to abandon the lease quietly, without public notice or formal filing. Permits would lapse. The road would not be maintained. Harvest units would not be reoffered. Lease fees would continue to be paid to avoid triggering a formal abandonment notice that would create a public record. On paper, the company still held the rights. In practice, the mountain was closed. Mitch was instructed to remove all monitoring equipment and secure all footage on an encrypted drive to be kept in the company's legal file. He was told not to return to the upper parcels alone. He was told not to discuss the events with anyone inside or outside the company. And he was given a retention bonus structured in a way that made it clear the money was for silence as much as service. Mitch drove up one last time in the fall of 2018 to retrieve his personal trail cameras. The drive up took longer than usual. The road had not been maintained since the third crew left, and the summer rains had washed gravel off the surface and plugged 2 culverts, turning sections into mud channels that his truck barely made it through. The landing, when he reached it, was already different. 3 months without human presence, and the fireweed was waist-high in the gravel. Young fir seedlings had taken root along the edges where the timber met the cleared ground. The equipment was gone, removed by the company's contracted heavy-haul team weeks earlier. The tire ruts from the lowboy trailers were already filling in with new growth. The mountain was taking back what had been taken from it. 4 of his 6 cameras were where he had placed them. He collected them, swapped the SD cards, and stowed them in his pack. The other 2 were gone entirely, not on the ground where they had been placed face up during the second crew's tenure. Gone. The trees where they had been mounted showed no sign of the cameras or the mounting hardware. The bark-patterned cloth he had wrapped around the housings was absent. The SD cards were absent. Everything had been taken off the mountain. Mitch stood at the base of the second tree, looking at the spot where his camera had been mounted 8 feet up inside a natural fork, and felt the hair on his arms rise. The creatures had carried the cameras away, not just removed them from the trees, which they had done before, carried them, taken them somewhere else, which meant they decided to change their response to the surveillance. Removing cameras and leaving them had not stopped Mitch from placing new ones, so they escalated. They removed the evidence itself. That is problem solving. That is an intelligence observing a pattern of human behavior over multiple years, identifying the failure of a previous countermeasure, and adapting its approach to produce a different outcome. Mitch had studied predator behavior for his entire career. He had never encountered an animal that modified its response to human monitoring equipment based on observed patterns of the human's behavior. Wolves learn to avoid traps. Bears learn to avoid bear spray. But neither species analyzes the human surveillance methodology, identifies the persistence pattern, and escalates from equipment removal to evidence removal as a countermeasure. That requires a cognitive process that the wildlife management profession does not have language for. On the 4 remaining cameras, the creatures appeared infrequently and always at the extreme edge of detection range, as if they had mapped the camera fields and were staying just outside reliable capture distance. On 2 occasions, a single figure was visible at the tree line, standing still, facing the camera, apparently aware of its position but choosing not to approach, monitoring the monitoring equipment, deciding whether to remove it or leave it in place, making a calculation about whether the risk of the camera recording their presence was worth the cost of engaging with it again. The Nez Perce people, who call themselves Nimi Ipu, have lived in this country for over 11,000 years. Their traditional territory encompassed the valleys of the Clearwater, the Snake, and the Salmon rivers. The ridgelines where the Lease sat are part of the landscape the Nimipu knew before any European set foot in the region. Lewis and Clark followed the Lolo Trail through these mountains in 1805, guided by Nez Perce scouts, who understood the terrain with an intimacy the expedition's journals acknowledged repeatedly. The Nez Perce spiritual tradition includes the concept of Way-Ikin, guardian spirits that manifest in animal form and attach themselves to individuals during vision quests conducted in remote wilderness. The tradition reflects a worldview in which the natural world is inhabited by beings whose intelligence and agency are recognized and respected, beings existing alongside humans in mutual awareness. When I contacted the Nez Perce tribe's Cultural Resources Department to ask about traditional knowledge of large canine beings in the upper Clearwater drainages, the representative did not deny that such beings were part of the tribe's traditional understanding. She said certain places in the mountains were known to the elders as belonging to other beings, and that the traditional response was avoidance and respect. She said the tribe's relationship with those places was not a topic to be discussed with outside media. The boundary was firm but not hostile. It was the boundary of a people who have spent millennia understanding what the timber industry discovered in 2016 and responded to with checks and locked cabinets. Linda Godfrey spent 30 years documenting dogman encounters across the Great Lakes and beyond, and the behavioral patterns she identified hold remarkably stable across geography, nocturnal activity, association with water sources and wildlife corridors, territorial behavior emphasizing warning over violence, awareness of human technology, coordinated movement suggesting social organization. Every one of those patterns is present in the Lease footage. The setting is different. The terrain is different. But the behavior is the same. The intelligence is the same. The geographic range suggested by the research is staggering. The 1887 Wexford County sighting in Michigan, the Bray Road encounters in Wisconsin in the early 1990s, reports from Kentucky, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Oregon, Washington, and now Idaho, separated by thousands of miles, across terrain that ranges from Great Lakes forest to high desert to the volcanic ridgelines of the Cascades to the granite and basalt of the Clearwater Mountains. Either hundreds of witnesses across a century and a continent have independently fabricated the same impossible animal, or something real exists that has adapted to a range of habitats far larger than any official agency has acknowledged. The behavioral consistency is what makes dismissal so difficult. A hoaxer in Michigan might describe a 7-foot bipedal canine, because that is the local dogman folklore. But the hoaxer in Michigan would not know to include the camera awareness, the territorial marking behavior, the graduated escalation protocol, the structured vocalizations, and the consistent restraint toward humans, because those details have never been widely published. Godfrey documented them across hundreds of case files, but the details are scattered through 3 decades of research, not compiled into a checklist that a fabricator could copy. When an independent witness in Idaho describes the same behavioral suite that Godfrey documented in Wisconsin, the explanation that both are lying requires a more elaborate conspiracy than the explanation that both are telling the truth. Mitch left the company in 2023. He had spent 5 years sitting in meetings where the lease was discussed in terms of carrying costs and timber valuation. Knowing what lived on that mountain made every number irrelevant. He had kept the encrypted drive in his home office. He had not told his wife. He carried the knowledge the way every witness in every story on this channel carries it, alone, insulated by the impossibility of what he knew and the certainty that sharing it would cost him everything he had built over a 20-year career. The first year after the 3rd crew left, Mitch barely functioned outside of work. He went through the motions, drove to the office, reviewed timber inventories, filed reports, came home, sat in his office with the door closed, running through the footage on the encrypted drive, looking for details he might have missed, looking for anything that would give him a handhold on what he was carrying. He did not find one. The footage showed what it showed. The thermal images were clear. The trail camera captures were unambiguous. The audio was what the audio analyst said it was. There was no alternative explanation that survived contact with the evidence. His wife noticed the changes. Mitch, who had spent every fall of their marriage in the mountains hunting elk, stopped going. He told her his knees were bad. What was true was that the idea of sitting in the timber before dawn, in the dark, in country where he now knew something lived that was smarter and faster and stronger than he was, produced a physical response he could not override with rational thought. His hands shook when he picked up his rifle. The system that has kept humans alive for 200,000 years was telling him the mountains were no longer safe. He could know intellectually that the creatures were 43 miles up a logging road on a specific ridgeline. His body did not care about the distance. His body had been in the presence of those things and it remembered the feeling, the way your body remembers a car accident or a fall, and it refused to put itself in similar conditions regardless of what his rational mind argued. He stopped fishing the North Fork of the Clearwater, which had been his weekend ritual for most of his adult life. He stopped volunteering for backcountry assignments. He requested a transfer to inventory management in Lewiston and spent his last 2 years at a desk, reviewing timber cruiser reports from other foresters, never going into the field himself. His supervisor noticed. Mitch said he was getting older, and the fieldwork was getting harder. The supervisor accepted it. People in the timber industry understand that the mountains take a toll on your body. Nobody understood that Mitch's body was fine. It was his sense of the world that was broken. Mitch told one person, a retired forester he had worked with for years, a man who had spent his own career in the Clearwater Mountains and who Mitch trusted to evaluate evidence without prejudice. Mitch drove to the man's house outside Grangeville on a Saturday afternoon, brought his laptop, and showed him everything. The company camera recordings, the thermal images, the trail camera captures of hands operating the buckle mechanisms, the audio, the photographs of tracks and territorial markings. The retired forester watched all of it. He asked questions about methodology, distances, equipment specifications. He examined the track photographs with the deliberate attention of a man who has measured thousands of animal tracks in the field. When it was finished, he sat in his kitchen chair without speaking for a long time. Then he said something that landed on Mitch like a stone. In 1991, during a timber cruise on a parcel in the Selway drainage about 40 miles south of Mitch's Lease, he had found tracks he could not identify. Large canid morphology, bipedal stride pattern, impossible dimensions. He had measured them, photographed them, and filed the photographs in a drawer in his office where they sat for 27 years. He had never told anyone. He had never followed up. He had classified it in his own mind as an anomaly and moved on, because the alternative was to classify it as real, and real meant everything Mitch was now living through. The loneliness, the silence, the slow erosion of a career spent walking past the truth because acknowledging it would cost too much. He told Mitch one more thing. A Nez Perce cultural resource specialist he had worked with in the 80s, a man who consulted on timber sales that crossed traditional use areas, had told him once that the upper drainages were places the old people avoided, not because they were sacred in the ceremonial sense. Because they belonged to beings the Nimipu recognized as permanent inhabitants of the landscape, beings whose territorial claims predated human presence in the region. The specialist had said it once, in the cab of a Forest Service truck driving between sale units, and then changed the subject. The retired forester had filed it the same way he filed the tracks. In a drawer, for decades. 2 men, 2 sets of tracks, 2 parcels of the same mountain range, separated by 40 miles and 27 years. Either both were wrong, which would require dismissing 70 years of cumulative field experience, or something has been living in the Clearwater Mountains for at least 3 decades, that the state of Idaho does not acknowledge, and the timber industry does not discuss. The institutional silence is not a conspiracy. It is a cascade of rational decisions that collectively produce an outcome nobody intended. The company does not disclose because disclosure would trigger regulatory inquiry, environmental litigation, and market valuation damage. If the footage became public, the company's other lease holdings in the region would face scrutiny. What are the implications for worker safety on company land if the company knew about the presence of an unidentified large predator and continued to send crews into the area? That is a question that a plaintiff's attorney would ask, and the answer would cost the company more than the timber was ever worth. The crews do not disclose because they signed NDAs backed by settlements they cannot afford to return. Mitch does not go through official channels because doing so would violate his employment agreement and destroy the professional reputation he spent 20 years building. Idaho Fish and Game does not investigate because nobody has filed a report their intake system can process. The department's predator classification system recognizes 6 large predators in Idaho: black bear, gray wolf, mountain lion, coyote, bobcat, and wolverine. There is no checkbox on the wildlife incident form for bipedal canid with demonstrated intelligence and camera manipulation capability. There is no procedure in the department's manual for what to do when a field report describes something the classification system says does not exist. The Forest Service does not investigate because the events occurred on private leasehold that falls outside their jurisdictional mandate. And the Nez Perce tribe does not share what they know because the knowledge belongs to a relationship with the land that predates every institution involved, and that the tribe has no obligation to disclose to organizations that would not understand or respect it. Each layer of silence reinforces the others. The company's silence means no official report reaches Fish and Game. Fish and Game's silence means no investigation generates evidence that would force the Forest Service to respond. The Forest Service's silence means no federal documentation reaches the academic community. And the tribe's silence, the oldest and deepest layer, endures for reasons that have nothing to do with bureaucracy and everything to do with a 10,000-year relationship with beings that the Western world refuses to acknowledge. The timber is still standing. Over $20 million in Douglas fir and western red cedar on ridgelines visible from Highway 12 on a clear day. The access road is deteriorating. Culverts plugging. Alders creeping in. In another 5 years, without maintenance, it will be impassable to anything wider than an ATV. The landing is growing over with fireweed and young fir seedlings. The stumps from the partial cuts that the first two crews made are rotting back into the soil, slowly disappearing under moss and fern. They could have hurt someone. At any point during 3 summers of escalating confrontation, they could have entered a trailer, confronted a faller in the cutting unit, ambushed a crew member walking between the landing and the latrine at 2 in the morning. They chose machinery over men. They chose property destruction over physical harm. Every encounter followed the same logic. Demonstrate presence, demonstrate capability, demonstrate that the cost of staying exceeds the cost of leaving. Then wait for the humans to make the rational decision, and think about what that decision-making implies. Killing a logger would trigger a massive response. Search and rescue, law enforcement, wildlife agency investigation, media attention. Exactly the kind of sustained human presence the creatures were trying to prevent. Broken equipment and spooked workers produce a different outcome. The crew leaves. The company calculates the loss. Another crew comes. More broken equipment. Bigger losses. Eventually the math stops working and the company walks away. The forest goes quiet again. That is not animal calculation. That is strategic analysis. Cost-benefit thinking applied across multiple encounters and time horizons. Understanding that the reaction to a dead human is categorically different from the reaction to a damaged machine, and choosing accordingly. Mitch said the selectivity of the equipment damage was what convinced him he was dealing with intelligence rather than instinct. A bear investigating a piece of heavy equipment will climb on it, scratch the paint, maybe chew on rubber components because of the texture. It does not identify and destroy the 3 systems that make the machine function, the hydraulics that give it motion, the fuel that gives it power, and the controls that let a human operate it, while leaving the structural frame intact. That requires understanding of cause and effect. Stop the machines and the cutting stops. The creatures were not trying to destroy the equipment. They were trying to shut down the logging operation. And when the first round of sabotage did not achieve that, they escalated to reconnaissance. And when reconnaissance confirmed the humans were not leaving, they escalated to total destruction. And when total destruction of one crew's equipment was repaired and a second crew arrived, they escalated again. And when a third crew arrived with new equipment and upgraded security, they demonstrated capabilities so far beyond what the company had planned for that the mathematics of the situation became inescapable. The cost of continuing to send crews up that mountain exceeded the value of the timber. The creatures had made the harvest unprofitable, and they did it without spilling a drop of human blood. The creatures on that mountain are not attacking the timber industry. They are managing it. They are enforcing a territorial boundary using an escalation protocol. Any military strategist would recognize. Minor disruption first, then warning signs, then vocal communication, then observation and assessment, then decisive action proportional to the threat, targeting operational capacity rather than personnel. At every stage, the option to escalate further existed and was not exercised. That is not predator behavior. That is the behavior of an intelligence that understands consequences, projects the results of its actions, and prefers the outcome that achieves its objective with minimum necessary force. The question that Mitch cannot stop turning over, and that I have been turning over since he first described the footage to me, is what happens when the math changes. What happens when the timber on that ridgeline is worth not 20 million but 50? What happens when the company changes hands and the new owners do not know the history? What happens when a logging crew shows up that does not leave after the first round of equipment destruction, that brings armed security, that decides to push through? The creatures have demonstrated graduated force and consistent restraint, but restraint has limits. And a cornered territorial intelligence that has been making rational decisions about force escalation for 3 summers is also an intelligence capable of deciding that restraint is no longer serving its purpose. The parallel to the Nez Perce experience on this same land is uncomfortable and unavoidable. In 1855, the Treaty of Walla Walla reserved approximately 7.7 million acres for the Nez Perce, a territory that included the Clearwater drainage and the mountains on either side. Subsequent treaties reduced the reservation to 1/10 of that size, and when gold was discovered on Nez Perce land, the government simply redrew the boundaries to exclude the gold-bearing areas. The Nez Perce War of 1877 Chief Joseph's fighting retreat across 1,300 miles of mountain terrain was the response of a people who had exhausted every other option for holding their land. They fought with tactical brilliance and strategic restraint, avoiding civilian casualties when possible, conducting themselves with a discipline their military opponents acknowledged publicly. General Oliver Howard, who pursued them across Idaho and Montana, called the Nez Perce the finest cavalry force in the world. They lost the war, as they were always going to lose it, because the numbers and the resources were on the other side. But they fought on the same ground where Mitch's Lease sits, through the same drainages, over the same ridgelines, and they fought for the same thing that whatever lives on that mountain is fighting for, the right to remain on land they have occupied since before anyone else arrived. Whatever lives up there is conducting its own version of the same campaign. It held its ground through decades of logging. When a new intrusion began, it responded with graduated force, escalating only when lesser measures failed, restraining itself at every stage from the violence it was clearly capable of. It is defending its homeland, the way any intelligent territorial being defends its homeland. With minimum force, with patience, with the confidence that the land will outlast whatever temporary disruption the intruder represents. And unlike the Nez Perce, it is winning. The timber company retreated. The road is closing. The forest is coming back. The beings on that mountain have achieved through patience and intelligence what Chief Joseph's people could not achieve, through courage and sacrifice, the preservation of a homeland against an intruder that was stronger on paper, but that did not have the will to absorb the cost of staying. Mitch told me one more thing during our last conversation. In the fall of 2022, before he left the company, he drove to the junction where the access road meets Forest Road 250 and sat in his truck for an hour, looking up at the ridgeline, the Douglas fir standing tall on the south-facing slopes, the dark band of cedar in the creek bottoms, the country he had walked for 20 years and loved the way you love a place that made you who you are. He rolled his window down and listened. October, the air was cold and sharp and carried the first edge of winter. Elk bugling in the middle distance, the sound bouncing off the canyon walls and coming back doubled. A raven on the ridge, calling once and then silent. And from somewhere far up the drainage, carried on the wind that comes down from the mountains in the fall, smelling of pine and cold water and distance. He heard a sound he recognized because it had been playing in his headphones for 5 years. A vocalization that rose through a sequence of tones and stopped. He felt relieved, not because the sound was comforting, because it confirmed the mountain was still occupied. The creatures were still there. The territory was intact. The trees were standing. The forest was healing from the partial cuts. The road was going back to the ground. And in the cedar groves and on the ridgelines and in the creek drainages where old-growth timber holds moisture and shelters the elk that move through corridors older than human memory, something was walking that had been walking those mountains for longer than anyone can calculate. Something had watched the logging companies come and go and the roads get built and the timber get cut. Something had decided, in whatever way it makes its decisions, that this particular piece of ground was not for sale. The evidence exists on an encrypted drive in a house in Lewiston. Company camera footage. Thermal recordings. Trail camera images of hands with claws operating buckle mechanisms. Audio with structured vocalizations. A bioacoustics analysis that stops short of the word language, but cannot find another word that fits. Photographs of tracks matching no species in the state's wildlife database. 3 NDAs and 3 settlements in a company legal file. No one outside the executive team has reviewed. It is all there, locked in the same institutional silence that protects the company's valuation and the crew's settlements and the foresters' pensions and the state's wildlife classifications and the tribe's traditional boundaries. Every door that could open stays closed, because the cost of opening it exceeds what anyone is willing to pay. The trees keep growing. The road keeps disappearing. The creatures keep walking the ridgelines that were theirs before any lease was drawn or any road was cut or any chainsaw fired in those mountains. They are still up there. They will be up there long after the lease expires and the culverts collapse, and the last trace of the access road vanishes under snowmelt and new growth, and the slow, patient work of a forest putting itself back together.